Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to this penultimate session at Change Now. And we're certainly keeping the knotty, complex conversations for this last conversation. My name's Ella Stopford-Sackville. I'm a managing director at Kite Insights. We work with organizations to develop the clarity, confidence, and capabilities to engage on pressing issues of our time: sustainability, climate, social issues. And I'm delighted to be moderating this evening's conversation. We're going to be talking about how do we finance a just transition, what are the structures in the financial architecture that are holding countries back, and what can we do about breaking down some of those challenges and barriers. We're going to have a tour of 3 different conversations that hopefully will add up to a great scene setting for all of you tonight. So we're going to start with a fireside chat with Laurence Tubiana. Then we'll move into a panel conversation with Audrey Rojkov and Kamal Rambarud, and then close with a fireside chat with Maria Saeed. So you'll meet all those speakers in a moment. But before we start, I just want to take a quick temperature of the room. Put your hand up if you feel this is a conversation you know very little about. It's something you maybe have never come across before. They're topics that you are seeing for the first time. Great. Well, welcome. Thank you for being brave and coming into this conversation. Who feels like they have a broad sense of some of the topics around the just transition and the financial architecture? They feel relatively well-versed? And who thinks of themselves as a bit of an expert? Who's working on this every day? There we go. Well, hopefully we can come to you for some questions at the end, sir. So let's kick off then. I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Laurence Tubiana, and I'll introduce her more properly when she comes up. Thank you, Laurence. Thank you for being here, Laurence, with us. Laurence really needs no introduction in this room, but I will give you a short introduction to her for any of you who are new to this space. Laurence is the CEO of the European Climate Foundation. She is the Dean of the Paris Climate School at Sciences Po and the co-chair of the Global Solidarity's Levies Task Force. As France's climate ambassador and special representative to COP21, she was one of the key architects of the Paris Agreement. So we're just so delighted to have you here with us tonight. So Laurence, I'm going to ask you to help set the scene a bit. You've been inside this debate for a long time, worked across many countries and with many of the institutions for whom this is their primary work. For people in this room who work in climate, or maybe don't, but don't have as much day-to-day experience on the topic of the just transition, how would you define the debt trap we're in today? Can you help set the scene a bit on what you're seeing?
So thank you for the opportunity to talk to all of you in a moment where we don't know when the bombing of Iran would stop. We don't know where the oil and gas crisis will end. And I think it will be good that we think altogether not only on the economic crisis looming, but as well as what is happening to people in Iran that nobody is taking care of. So I cannot just abstract myself from that particular moment where really the power politics all over the world are really now just neglecting who people are, where we should take care. And the debt trap is unfortunately another example of finally in these very troubled times, nobody really cares about what really the basic needs of people are. And in this context where you see that so many countries are now in such difficult situation, so they have to choose between paying for the debt service or funding health, education, and what is needed in a normal country for the people. So we are in a particular moment where the debt issue was discussed many times. Of course, the lenders are different now. China is a big one, and then the private sector is a major one as well in general. But then the cost of borrowing capital for many countries is very, very high. More than, of course, what France, for example, would borrow at 2 or 3%, maybe a little higher these days. But for India or for Nigeria or for Zambia, for example, the rate is really, really high, much around 10% for some countries. So it's really difficult then to do investment, and then if you don't have the national resources, economic growth, which is very low when you look at the past 10 years, then you see that it is very difficult to not to privilege the debt service and not finally and don't really take care of what you should take care in your own country, at least from the public service point of view. So we are in a quite dramatic moment. The oil crisis now will make this debt trap even higher because the imports are just skyrocketing. And then it's very, very just there. We have seen only the beginning of that. We know that for many countries, the real shock will come in 10 or 15 days when really the stocks will be over. And so it's a really an incredible moment to talk about that. And in a way, the one who are still lending money to all these countries, they are countries that are really focused, or private capital focused on the short term. So we have a disconnect between the needs of development, the situation actually as we see it, and the capacity of all countries to come together just to try to offer a solution. And now the debt is there, and IMF is always monitoring when the next country will not be able to pay and what kind of restructuration they need in a moment where really the space, the fiscal space of countries is very, very limited. So it's more dramatic than we think, because this discussion has been pushed on the side.
I was going to ask you a question about what's changed in the last 12 months on this agenda. You've already answered to some of that. You're making me wonder whether I should be asked what's changed in the last 12 days as we're living in such a deeply disrupted financial system and market. But maybe if we take a step back from after acknowledging the realities of today for the people on the ground experiencing the challenges of that debt trap, who benefits from this system staying as it is, and how in the many spheres of work that you are in today, how do you fight against that? Like, where are our opportunities and scope for change in what is a very risky and difficult context?
Well, of course, who is benefiting from that shock? And I'm not talking about the windfall profit of oil and gas, companies or the producers, but just who is really lending at such a high price? Of course, private capital mainly, because they make countries pay a very high premium, when in reality the risk is probably much lower than what they frame the cost for. At least it's very different among countries, but then the currency risk, everything is valued very, very high. So who's benefiting of that? Private capital, certainly, because anyway, they are the first who are paid back. And some lenders like China, but because they are just focusing on the short term. But it's now a moment where we have to look at it and restructure all this debt that is there, because low-income countries, one after one, are in impossibility to pay back. But what are the solutions? Because it's not only restructuring of the debt and, in a way, alleviating the weight. And there are good ideas when a country is affected by a very big catastrophe, a natural catastrophe like a typhoon, or that now we have clauses in IMF that countries are allowed to stop paying debt to take care of their own people. So that's one element which is important, because the countries need and the people need immediate relief. The second element is we begin to have instruments to see how we can lower the cost of capital. We see from different angles and different initiatives that can use the public money, very scarce, I must say, to guarantee where the private capital could come and then pay less, in general, lower the premium that this private capital is asking for. And these guarantee systems that now years and years we are discussing them, but they are now real offers and real structures that can be put in place with the condition somehow that, and in particular talking about, the investment needed to combat climate change, have this just transition, requires that the multilateral development banks play the game. And it is, of course, a contested field now, where, of course, US being in some of the boards and really not allowing some of the big institutions to go on that direction. Just transition then is threatened by this decision. The third element I think we need to look at is we have to widen the fiscal space to just get the resources on the ground. And of course, you look at the budget of many Western countries. We saw, of course, US backtracking totally for their responsibilities in ODA. So what is the solution now? That's why we are trying to promote solidarity levies, because there is a number of sectors that are, in our understanding, a lot of polluters and really escape most of the tax. That's the case of aviation, that's the case of maritime transport, that's the case of cryptocurrencies, that's the case of many other sectors where, in reality, the wealth is concentrating, but there are no sharing of responsibility over time. So that's why I think it's good we initiate a new reflection. It's not a new one, but we put in place, for example, what we are, advocating for, that the premium flyers, the one who fly business class or first class or the private jet, should pay their fair share, and they are not. So it's really for, even on the social justice point of view, is no reason that people, whoever they are in South Africa or Brazil or France, they pay tax on their gasoline for bringing their children at school, and the private jet don't pay anything. So that's not logical again. So I do think as well these guarantees, these solidarity levies, and then we have to do a debt swaps. It's a promising instrument. We can offer national investment in exchange of these debt swaps. So that values, it was always very small amounts until now. I think it's a big avenue, at least for the lenders can do that. The problem is who owns the lending, who owns the land now. And the problem is that it has changed. It's not the same countries. That was G7 is much, much less relevant for this debt management, even if France can do a lot and will do, hopefully, to try to gather all countries to find a solution. But at the same time, they are different markets. And that's where I think we have to put some responsibility on the financial markets that finally are concentrating all the wealth, and without, in a way, working together with others to alleviate the task. The concentration of wealth, as you know, has skyrocketing since 2021 in the COVID crisis, everywhere, in every country. And that's the problem we are not dealing with. And that's why there is so much support for the Zuckman tax, the tax on the 1%. And I think it's now legitimate because how we can do. There is no other way, because all the fiscal paradise, tax haven that finally reduce even more the capacity of government to tax. So I think there are solutions.
Thank you so much. And we're going to get into some of those other solutions with the speakers a bit later. You talked about the G7, no longer being a space for the right space for some of these solutions to be drawn out and hashed out, given the changing geopolitical landscape. Where else are you putting your attention? What are the other is it in between individual nations? Are you looking to the G20? What are the other groups of organizations and countries where people like yourself and others here can push for some of those solutions in more of a global way?
I think the civil society can do a lot, as well as, in my view, the business sectors that want to invest in just transition. I think we have to team up, because we have to call the government responsibility, of course, and the private capital responsibility. Lucy certainly mentioned all this already. We need to make, in a way, to show that these super benefits that are being concentrated now are not viable. You cannot have this concentration of wealth and all the rest of society that are falling back into poverty. So I think civil society has this role, and many organizations are doing it very well. And then we have to understand that in some countries there are an enormous capacity of savings that are there. No, European savings are going to US bonds. Why don't we invest them into just transition on a more global scene? There is a sovereign wealth fund who can do much more than, of course, initially buying real estate in Paris. That was a norm, or bonds of rich countries, and they could be on supporting the development of the whole planet on this just transition, because of course what we need is basically relatively cheap capital. Mm-hmm. So all this is possible, but we have to change the atmosphere of the conversation. Yeah. We have really to say, you can't just avoid just responsibility. You can't live in a world where the 1% will try to have refugees where everybody will be very, very in difficult situation, and you can't escape the planet. Well, of course, we can go to Mars, that's for sure, but at least
will you
not
be going
for
to
the
Mars?
Majority of the population.
Will you be going to Mars, Laurence?
Yes. I don't want to go, but I'm happy that others go. Really, frankly, that I would be happy to see that.
Well, I think you're calling for a shift in narrative around the conversation of just transition. You're calling for creativity in the way that we think about the different pots of money around the world and how it can be used to address some of these challenges and be pushed into the solutions. And you're calling for other actors who might have traditionally seen themselves as outside of this conversation to find their place and really start putting their money where their mouth is, in the English phrase. So I'm just going to close with one final question to you, Laurence, which is, to a room of engaged climate leaders, what is one misconception about climate finance that you would like to debunk or take down that you see often?
I think the main problem is we always think that climate finance is not development finance. I think that's the main problem. We should not think even about climate finance, but think about just transition and sustainable development again. We need water, we need energy, we need food security. This is about development. We need a development for that, and this development has to be low carbon, because if not, it will not exist anymore in maybe 15 or 20 years. So there is no reason to have this discussion that climate finance should be different. That should be the one, it should be mainstream, and that's why it's so important the alignment on Paris Agreement goals on finance are seen as the alignment on development finance as the same goal. And that's why we are now, last year we celebrate the 10 years of Paris Agreement. We celebrate as well the 10 years of Sustainable Development Goals. And we are forgetting them all the time. So I think that's the moment we reconsider and don't listen only to arms and power, but to people again.
Thank you so much, Laurence. Thank you for being with us. So we got a holistic perspective there from Laurence about the change that is happening every day, but also the change that needs to happen across financial institutions, private finance, public institutions. And now we're going to dig a bit deeper into some of the tools in the financial architecture that we are able to use today and some of the institutions that are doing this work every day on the ground. So I'm delighted to welcome to the stage my panel, Audrey Rojkov and Kamal Rambarud. Please give them a warm round of applause. Thank you. No, you go ahead. You sit there. We can huddle a bit closer together. Thank you both for being here. I'll do some very quick introductions. So Audrey, thank you for joining us. Audrey is the Climate and Nature Director of AFD, the French Development Agency, which is one of the largest bilateral development finance institutions in the world. She has over 20 years' experience in international cooperation and sustainable development all across the world, and most recently in South Africa as Regional Director for Southern Africa for AFD. And Kamal Rambarud. Kamal is a researcher in debt and development finance at the Institute for Economic Justice, where he leads the Global Economic Governance Project. He played a key role in South Africa's G20 presidency last year and has worked with, I'm going to make you explain what this acronym is, UNCTAD and Wits University. What's UNCTAD? UNCTAD, yeah. Which means?
The United Nations Conference for Trade and Development.
Perfect.
Yeah.
For any of those who didn't know, like me. So we've just heard Laurence really set the systemic frame, connecting the shock we're experiencing today and every day is changing with the current context, and also the opportunities she sees for change, some of the solutions that she's really excited about, and some of the actors that she wants to bring in to the just transition conversation. So maybe we can start with a bit of a framing question. I'd love you to share the vantage point you're speaking from. So explain to our audience the part of the system that you are acting in, and what, in your view, is the biggest thing getting in the way of addressing the just transition at the speed and scale that we need to. The biggest challenge, yes. Maybe we'll start with you, Audrey.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ella, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you today. Thank you, all of you, for attending this session. First of all, I cannot agree more with what Laurence said before. At AFD, we were lucky enough to have Laurence chairing our board. So, well, we had many times this kind of conversation. Just to be more precise on AFD, I'm not sure you all know what AFD does, but we are a development bank, the French Development Bank. Actually, we operate in 120 countries. We provide loan and grants for development projects. Loans like 90% and grants 10%. And in 2025, we provided 13 billion euros of financing, among which 8 billion of climate finance. Just a little word to make a transition with what Laurence said, because I fully agree with climate finance versus development finance. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I really wonder if we should not, instead of thinking that development finance has climate co-benefits, we should maybe think about only working for climate and having development co-benefits. I mean, the urgency of climate may justify such an approach. But going back to your point, sorry for that, the biggest challenge, of course, in every context, every country, there are multiple constraints at the same time. But I would say the biggest challenge is the just dimensions of the just energy transition. I'm talking about poverty, inequality, unemployment. I mean, if you want your transition to be a success, you have no choice but to incorporate those dimensions into the planning of your transition. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, and thank you everyone for coming. It's a very packed day, and it's at the end of the day, and it's we're talking about debt, so it's not super sexy, but thank you for being here and engaging on this topic. Um, I think one of the biggest challenges for many developing countries, especially in Africa, to financing the transition is the debt crisis. Right, we are facing a debt crisis in Africa. Whereby at least 57% or 570 million Africans live in countries that spend more on debt servicing than they do on healthcare, on education, or on financing the infrastructure for the green or just transition. So this is probably the biggest challenge, I would say, is the debt crisis at the moment. And I think when we speak about debt, it is technical. There are technical elements of it, like what is the interest rate versus the growth rate? How long is the maturity, or how long will the debt last for? There's questions about, there's all kinds of seemingly technical questions. But I think one thing that we need to really appreciate in this moment is that debt is a relation of power, right? Debt is a relation of power, and it has been for, since sovereign debt has existed, and since it started between the Italians and the English in the Florentine, cities, and this is still an experience today. There was a great talk earlier by Ranim Daragme and Mazin Kumsie, who spoke about colonialism and imperialism in Palestine, and how we need to continue to identify coloniality, or the continuation of colonial relations of power in today's world, right? And one of the markers of coloniality as it continues today is relations of power through debt, right, as an instrument. And I mean, looking at France and a lot of the wealth in France, a lot of the wealth in France that we see around us, is a vestige of colonial exploitation. And this actually continued through many countries. For example, Haiti, in 1804, when they gained independence, was forced to pay a colonial debt of about what is today 21 billion US dollars to have their independence granted by the French, which was only paid 140 years later. And I ask myself, as someone from the global south, in how many hundred years will we pay off our debt to our transition, a transition that we need to make not because of our historical emissions, which are less than 4%, but because we live in an international financial architecture that is essentially stacked up against the global south.
Thank you, Kamal. And I know, we've had some conversations in the lead up to this, Kamal, describing the debt crisis as this recurring pattern. And Laurence touched on some of the current shocks, obviously, but it's the recurring pattern triggered by shocks and things happening outside of the countries which are bearing the cost. And Audrey, your work at AFD is really on the ground in lots of those countries trying to finance the transition. I'd love to move us, as we are in the Change Now way of moving really quickly through these hugely complex topics, to think about where is the scope for change and action today, and who needs to move to make that change happen. And maybe Kamal, I can start with you this time.
So who are the actors you're asking that need to?
Where is the scope for change,
Yeah.
and who are the actors that need to change?
So I think I would say, speaking about, at least in the context of debt, there are three main areas in the scope for change that I think are really important. The first is around multilateral development banks, right? Yes, there is a crisis around debt currently in Africa and in parts of the global south. But we also, besides restructuring that through what's called the G20 Common Framework, which is basically where countries go to restructure their debt, beyond the restructuring of existing debt, we also need new financing, right? And that new financing needs to come from institutions that offer the financing at concessional rates, as grants, with long maturities, and without conditionalities that restrict the policy space or restrict the policy sovereignty of countries. And multilateral development banks are one of the places that should happen. And one of the things that needs to happen there is for the very rich countries to upscale those multilateral development banks to increase the amount of concessional financing that is dispersed throughout the world. So that's the one element. The other element is taxation, right? Africa, for example, loses out $88 billion a year on illicit financial flows. A lot of this money is going to global north countries and other parts of the world. And I mean, that amount alone is enough to finance a debt restructuring throughout the continent, for example. So that's another element of reform that needs to happen. And then finally, I think taxation of multinational corporations. What we're seeing at the moment is a race to the bottom. All countries are competing to have as lower tax rates for multinationals as possible because it attracts the capital from those multinationals. If all countries around the world set the minimum tax rate for multinational corporations, this would avoid this tax avoidance. A lot of these companies pay nearly no taxes whatsoever. And there was an agreement to have a 15% taxation on all multinationals that had a revenue of more than 750 million euros. But the US has since reneged on that agreement. And I think that one of the things that your question brings us to is the fact that we are seeing a race to the bottom in terms of taxation, in terms of imperialist wars for resources, in terms of this poly-crisis that is reinvigorating the climate crisis, geopolitical tensions, and the debt crisis. It's a vicious circle, really.
There's scope for change across all the different parts of that circle. I'm going to bring Audrey in just in the interest of time. Audrey, in your work and the role you have, where do you see the greatest scope for change?
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, I'm working in a development bank that provides mainly loans. But just a little moment on what we are doing as a development bank. Just to say that, of course, every state needs to borrow money everywhere for a very long time. What we do is to provide money, to provide financing, to provide loans that are at a very concessional rate. We are a non-profit development bank, meaning that we borrow money on the market using the rating of the French state, and we on-lend the money to another partner without making money. We just cover our cost for administration. But I fully agree with everything you said, but it applies to development finance in general. But if we go back to financing the just transition, I would say that we have a little scope for change in a sense that it's not only the volume of financing that matters, but the direction of the financial flows. And we can work a little bit on it before increasing the level of the financing. We have many options for this. We can work on integrating climate considerations into budget planning. We can work on reallocating public expenditures toward climate-compatible investments. We can change incentives in every country to gradually phase out harmful subsidies. And we can remove barriers that hinder private investments. That are first steps to consider financing the just transition within the fiscal space we have. Thank you.
And I think that that role that you can play in de-risking it for others and bringing these other institutions, other types of capital into the mix in terms of the amount of money as well is incredibly important. I think I want to turn to a concrete example of a country, because we've been talking a lot about financial architecture, debt systems and traps. You've both worked, well, Kamal, you are from South Africa yourself. Audrey, you spent many years working in South Africa. So I'd like to zoom in a little bit on South Africa as a country. It's a middle-income country, significant emissions profile, deep financing needs, and a just energy transition partnership that was created and designed a few years ago to show how international finance can mobilize behind a country's transition. So maybe, Audrey, you can start by telling me a bit about what that experience of working in South Africa for you at AFD helped you understand about the role that development finance can play, and maybe give some specific examples of the types of projects you were involved in there, and maybe what were some of the challenges you faced.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, to say that I'm very happy to share this discussion with Kamal, because well, for those who don't know South Africa, it's probably one of the most beautiful and interesting country where you should go. I'm sure he will, of course, talk better than me on South Africa, but just to say that it's a country facing, as I said at the beginning, multiple constraints. It's an economy heavily dependent on coal. More than 80% of the electricity is produced from coal power plants. Those coal power plants are aging, and the cost of maintenance are very high. At the same time, it's a country where we have a very high level of inequalities coming from apartheid, and a poorly diversified economy, and a very high level of unemployment, especially among youth, and limited fiscal space. So all of this is making the situation very complicated. But what I found in South Africa is a very, very, very strong political willingness to try to build from this crisis, to try to seize the opportunity of the necessary just energy transition, to engage in a project for society, and to try to tackle the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. This is what I found in South Africa.
Great.
Just a word on AFD and what we did there. In close coordination with our partners, we decided to get involved into what we found the most systemic possibility for a change, is to provide a policy-based loan, meaning a loan that will trigger a reform. We decided, all together with the government, to work on the just dimension, because what I said is probably the most important part of the just energy transition. And we delivered, the last loan we delivered was a 400 million euros loan, and it was focused on inclusive economic diversification, access to skills, and job creation in the areas most affected by the transition. Just to be clear on that, our financing, even if I'm very proud of it, I've worked a lot with our South African partners, remains a very, very small part of the needs.
A drop in the ocean.
It's a drop in the ocean, of course. But the role of development banks, and at least the way we thought our role was in South Africa, was to act as a catalyst, to combine financial instruments and technical cooperation, to support the production of locally produced knowledge from local think tanks to inform the decision, the public decision, and to leverage on our ability to work with both local partners, including our sister institution, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the DBSA, and international partners, whether they are bilateral or multilateral. So we had a role to bring all of this together and help start the process and launch the dynamic. Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. Kamal, what's your take on what the Just Energy Transition Partnership revealed about where there's still a need to push for reform? What are you and the people you're working with, the advocates you're working with, calling for?
Thanks so much, Ella. And I feel really bad criticizing the JET IP because I've just been told I have the best country in the world, and and it's difficult to do that. And I've also just said that we need more development finance, right? But there are a number of issues around the JET IP that we must raise nonetheless, right? The first is around the fact that the JET IP is being pushed as a model for global north and global south kind of financing, right? At some point, this was the model of how we're going to transition, especially middle income countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, etc. And one of the issues around this is that the JET IP again relies very heavily on debt, right? There's only 4% of the JET IP's total funding that is grant funding, and that grant funding isn't to projects, right? It's to knowledge production, which you can't really own anyway, right? So this is a huge problem, especially if in the current context of very difficult financial context within Africa, you're saying now we've got a debt crisis and our solution is to offer you more debt. So this is a slightly problematic issue, right? So the heavy reliance on debt is a huge problem. And then the other issue is around risks, right? So the JET IP, along with a lot of other financing models that are coming out of the World Bank and what is known as the Wall Street consensus, is this approach to financing around de-risking, right? De-risking is a huge problem because ultimately you can't really de-risk anything, right? If there's a risk, right? The question is around how do you distribute that risk? And the problem with the de-risking model is that it's putting the risks of the transition onto the state, so it's socializing the risks and it's privatizing the profits, right? So this is one of the issues with the de-risking model that the JET IP adopts. Another issue is around the risks to policy space, right? These loans, the loan that Audrey just mentioned, and other loans, if you read the contracts, they connect the conditionality of World Bank programs. So it will say, we will give you this debt, but you have to continue the World Bank program that has policy conditionalities. And many of those policy conditionalities we can agree with around transitioning, but some of them are macroeconomic, right? Some of them speak about issues of fiscal consolidation, of sound macroeconomic policies. A lot of those sound macroeconomic policies are around cutting social spending. So we're taking this just transition loan, that connects to a World Bank condition, that connects to an IMF framework, a macroeconomic framework, that says cut social spending. And so the just loan is connected to the unjust social policy that will come out of it, right? So this is all part of the kind of financial framework that underpins these debt obligations.
Kamal, I'm going to have to get you to wrap up.
Sure.
Wrap up that answer.
Sure. So the last point I'd make on that is that there are alternatives to this model, right? And some of those alternatives lie in tax. And I think we'd both agree on a wealth tax in a country like South Africa. The most unequal country in the world definitely needs a wealth tax. But there's other levies. There's reforms to retirement funds. There's changing the mandate of the central bank or offering green differentiated capital requirements, which will make the cost of borrowing for green projects cheaper than those of brown projects, right? So there are alternatives to the JET IP that can be followed.
Thanks, Kamal. And just to close us off here before we move on to the final section of today's session, maybe you could share, if you could shift one norm or one rule or one assumption today to close the debt trap or address the just transition, which one would you choose to have the greatest impact? Kamal, you've just rolled off a few. Maybe you want to go first, and then Audrey, I'll hand over to you.
The one thing I think that I would change in my country, and I would hope other countries would be interested in this too, is democratizing the economic system. Okay, economic justice, I believe, requires economic democracy, and one of the things that has happened around financing is that the decisions around loans or financing from international financial institutions doesn't get parliamentary approval or scrutiny in countries like South Africa. I would argue that if there are any loans being taken out with conditionalities or foreign currency risks or the huge shouldering of risks of investment, Parliament and the people need to participate in that and approve that lending before it happens. And I mean, we've seen this in Argentina, we saw it in Mozambique, we saw it in Zambia, all countries that recently had debt crises.
Yeah.
All of these governments looked back and they said, how did we get here? And one of the issues was there wasn't enough oversight over this lending and this debt. And they all made a law that says, actually, Parliament needs to approve this debt before it's taken on and approve these conditionalities before it's taken on. And I think that that's a model for all countries to follow as well.
Thanks, Kamal. Audrey, final word with you. What's the one rule, one norm, one assumption?
I have so many.
You have to choose one.
If I can choose only one, I would say to restore development models in which countries are at the center of the decision-making process. I think this is the rationale behind the current establishment of the country platforms. South Africa has a very strong one. South Africa is very structured to be able to orient the financing, the debt, to its own objectives. Just to say that in 2019, we set up a coalition of public development banks, 500 development banks in the world, the Finance in Common initiative, to precisely start to reshape the international financial architecture and to give a stronger role to the public development banks that are national, like the DBSA in your case.
Great.
Thank you.
Check out the Finance in Common initiative,
Yeah.
follow the work of Kamal, and hopefully you can continue the conversation with both of these great speakers. Will you please give them a round of applause? So sorry. I've maybe just broken Audrey's iPad, but I really hope I haven't. I'm so sorry. Okay. Thank you both, and last but not least, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Maria Said. We've mapped the architecture, the pressure points, we've talked about the case for reform, and we pointed to solutions today that need to be seen and activated by many different actors in the financial system. So Maria is going to join me for a final conversation where we're going to zoom out a little bit, try and make sense a bit of what we've heard, and hopefully we will have a couple of options for questions for a few of you from the floor. So just to introduce you, Maria, delighted to be with you on stage again 2 years later. Maria is a macroeconomic researcher and policy advocate at the Third World Network. She works in coalition with feminist organizations from the Global South to reimagine the fiscal architecture. Originally from Pakistan, she has worked with institutions like the State Bank of Pakistan, the UNDP, and many others, and with climate justice campaigns linked to the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion. She sits inside negotiating spaces like the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN, and makes the point of bringing other advocates into those spaces, however tough they might be. So thank you for joining us, Maria. you've been listening to the whole conversation so far. We've zoomed in, we've zoomed out, we've gone into specific country case studies, we've looked at examples and tools of some of the structures today. What's one idea or concept that you've heard that maybe surprised you or gave you a sense of hope and possibility for how we can utilize those tools today?
Thank you so much, Ella, for number one, that long introduction, but also I'm super happy actually that Kamal, Audrey, and Laurence were able to really set the stage in terms of trying to break down this complex architecture of what international financial architecture is. It's often treated as an elephant in the room. And I'm glad that the way that they explained everything, I hope that by the end of the day today or after this session, people are able to relate on their own in terms of like how they can relate to these systems and how they can actually challenge them, because I think that's where the hope lies. It's about challenging, resisting, and then creating a platform that shows what's wrong and what's needed. And
I think that the perspective that you bring, you call yourself a feminist macroeconomist. Maybe you can explain to the audience what that approach and what that lens means, and how does it open up a slightly different analysis on the economy than other conventional analysis?
Yeah, I think, so we've heard about the gross domestic product, GDP, since the past 2 days. And what is there that is not really captured in it is what half of the population is doing most of the time. So that's the elephant of the room. That's basically the care work, the unpaid and the paid care work that's not really taken into account. It's about the elderly care, the child care, the fetching of water, the fetching of woods for fuel. These are the things that are really not really discussed when it comes to the global north spaces. But when you talk about the global south countries, that's the everyday struggle of a woman. And not to say that that's completely different from how women are facing challenges in another part of the country. But that's something that's not really captured when it comes to the productive and the unproductive sector. And that's where the differentiation lies. So when we're talking about that, we're basically talking about why is that 1 in 3 women are facing gender-based violence? Why is that the climate financing is only reaching out to 17% of the communities on ground? Why is that we are not really getting ahead with development financing when we are actually waging wars and spending $29.9 trillion into the war economy and basically aiding the defense contractors that are becoming trillionaires over time? At the same time, why are we not talking about Pentagon or the military war emissions that are being emitted and are not really talked about into the climate spaces? Why is that this is still not part of the emission reporting when it comes to the Kyoto Protocol or abiding by it? So these are all the lenses that you really have to dig down, and I think that's where the feminist macroeconomic lens comes out, because it's not something that's like putting women in the equation and then you're basically closing the GDP gap. It's basically questioning the whole picture. You're basically questioning and challenging the patriarchal, new colonial, and the imperialist structures that have been in place, and why are they still so strong that we're not able to challenge them?
And we've heard this. Make sure you hear that round of applause. But we've heard the other speakers talk about some of the tools in the financial system that they are most excited about in the current context, or they feel need to be put most energy in. From your vantage point, where are you seeing progress to address the gap that you see, and where are coalitions of people from across different silos coming together? Because we're all operating in a slightly siloed context. You have certain institutions, certain disciplines, certain movements, and certain geographies. So where is the space in between that we can have some of these more robust conversations, acknowledging the gaps and the opportunity for action?
So I think I'll start with, firstly, I think we have to really look into the whole international financial architecture, which I will not repeat because I think the speakers before me have really fleshed it out in the most detailed manner. And by the end of the day today, I think people should also reflect on the fact that it's not technical anymore, it's not neutral. It's made technical and neutral so that people are not really able to treat it as political. And I think that's the root of the problem is political, so the treatment needs to be political as well. And from that aspect, I think what's important is that last year, as part of the United Nations Financing for Development mechanism, they came up with the Sevilla Platform Action Initiatives. This was led by Spain, Mexico, Colombia. So it's an alliance of the countries that's from Global North, countries with the Global South countries and trying to work on the gender initiatives. Mm-hmm. There are almost 60 to 170 indicators that they have highlighted, particularly to take into account all the inequalities that needs to be captured at the core of the care crisis and the climate crisis. And that came through the network of coalitions being built from the civil society, the policymakers, the activists in the room, the legal scholars, the member states, and the political willingness of the governments at the end. And this all brought this initiative at the forefront. Now, is that initiative enough? No, but it set the stage. The second step is about the financing that's needed to make these initiatives being capitalized and realized at the level where the war is being capitalized. Because one of the economists really said it that way, that when it comes to war, somehow the money appears from God knows where, we know from where, but when it comes to like really working on the development initiatives, that's where we are lacking the willingness, which is entirely political. So I see that this is where the silos can come together. It's about mobilization, it's about bringing technical expertise, it's about technical cooperation, it's about all of our skill sets coming together and really making the change happen.
So it needs to be led by It's political, it needs to be led by politics, and you need to see national governments coming together to start to address some of these topics head on. I know we've got a room of people who are of differing levels of engagement on this topic. I mean, what advice would you give to anyone in this room who is interested in this conversation, wants to learn more, go deeper, become an advocate themselves? What would your advice to them be?
That's a tough one, though, because I think there are different ways of engaging with the topic. I mean, you really have to choose which one of the topics really calls to you, and then you really have to have that commitment. There's a lot of frustration in these processes because, of course, there's a reason why they've made so technical. But again, it's like finding your alliances and finding your people and then cooperating with them. And I think we have the tools, we have the innovative ideas. We don't need more innovative ideas anymore. It's just a matter of making them work and making them work with a people-centric approach. As long as we are going to go for the growth and the GDP perspective, it's not going to go anywhere. We will always be thinking about profits over people. And I think that's where the narrative needs to change. So it's really about changing the epistemology of economy overall and reclaiming the narrative of economic initiatives and what economic development looks like.
So your advice to them is to really choose their lane, choose your focus area in this conversation, and think about reframing the narrative,
Yeah.
if I had to summarize. So I don't think we're going to have time for questions, sadly, but I do want to ask you a final question, and hopefully you can come and find the speakers at the front if you want to ask them some direct questions. In this work, Maria, what keeps you going? How do you maintain your own resilience? And who do you look for inspiration?
So I think three things. One, I think there's like one person on my shirt. And people who don't know about her, it's Assata Shakur. So I think the Global South scholars who have been in the resistance movements, and this is why I say that the movements are at the core of changing the structure of the economy overall. Second of all, I think if the 1% of the population can think about dimming the sun and going to Mars, I think we still have a lot of power to come up with our liberation, dignity, and rooting for resistance. And thirdly, Gaza. Gaza has been the highlight of why people need to connect to land, resistance, and liberation. And that's the resilience that everyone needs to have, because these structures, they were created for a reason. And of course, we have to really fight through them in the most resilient way possible. And I think that's where the motivation can come from.
Thank you so much, Maria. Can we give her a lovely round of applause? Thank you for being here. Thank you for sticking around, everyone, and for being part of this great conference. I really hope you follow the work of these speakers, read about their research, follow them online. Laurence Tubiana, Audrey Rojkov, Kamal Rambarud, and Maria Said. Thank you so much.